how am I going to get the work to pay these bills and all that? And now it's that, but it's social, it's cultural, it's spiritual. It's the playing field is so much deeper.
Right.
No, it was funny. I had my first video in a long time that got over 1 million views. From the hospital delivery room. I'm in a red tracksuit just because I actually kind of troll myself into getting tracksuits, but I joke, my wife's recording and I'm like, hey babe, we just saved $2,500. The problem is that you're not going to get an epidural now.
Right.
It's like, it got like so much controversy, 20,000 something likes and all that. But the women in the comments were like, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, how am I going to be able to afford my golf clubs if I pay for this $2,500 epidural? But well, thanks for joining the show, Michael. Love everything you've been doing. I've been following you for quite some time. But I want to start off by asking you about something that I would love to know, which is you've got twins at Clemson and University of
NC State,
and then you've got another kid at UNC. What is football season like in your household?
Football's a lot of fun. Basketball's a lot of fun at ACC schools. I went to Wake Forest, so I mean we've got the full gamut there.
That's great. That's great. So what? Okay, so you're from Western North Carolina, is that right?
Yep. Grew up in Blowing Rock, tiny little town on the Blue Ridge Parkway. About 534 people when I lived there.
And then your dad was an accountant and your mom was a librarian. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
That's a great combo, man.
It really is. And it's straight out of the middle class.
Yes.
I think, the thing that just continually amazes me is, I went to school, played sports, went to church, and I worked, right? And so, mowed lawns and, odd jobs. I got my first full-time job at 14, paid my way through, worked all the way through high school full-time, paid my way through college, paid my way through graduate school, law school, moved back to North Carolina. I had a blind date 3 weeks after I graduated from law school and met Susie, and we've been together for 28 years. You
didn't have to deal with all the Tinder and online dating world. You just cut right to the chase.
We did, but it like I've lived the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
You think about it. The American dream is get an education, get a job, get married, buy a house, and raise kids and have them in a safe and secure environment to be able to go forward and do better than you did.
Yes.
And I've gotten to live that American dream right in North Carolina. It's absolutely fantastic. Ultimately, that's why I'm running for Senate, because I want every one of your kids and your grandkids and everybody's kids to be able to have that same opportunity. And right now, we have to fight for this American dream. I mean, it's completely under assault.
Yeah. And well, we were talking a little bit before the show about Roy Cooper and what a disaster he's been across the board. It's like you can't point to just one area like the economy, because there are these pretty little white girls getting stabbed to death on a train by, a guy that had 17 prior violent criminal arrests. Like, if you could summarize like why we need to make sure he does not go to DC and inflict this on the rest of the country, what would you say?
Well, look, when you think about the government, right, writ large, right, any government, whether it's federal, local, or state, the highest priority has to be keeping its citizens safe, right? And so protecting its kids and its communities. And when we look at Roy Cooper's record, he's an abject failure on every single one of those levels. We talk about the environment. What has he done, to try and help families do better in terms of job creation and other things like that? He's vetoed tax cuts. He voted for tax hikes when he was a legislator. He announced when he was going to run for the Senate that he would have voted against, extending the Trump middle class tax cuts, right? And against no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. You look at the crime issues, and that's a whole separate conversation when you think about him being the most pro-crime governor in the history of the state. When Antifa and BLM were burning down all of our cities, he was out there marching with them.
Yeah.
We talk about him signing an executive order and creating the revolving door that put violent criminals back on the streets again and again and again. As soon as they're arrested and processed, they go back on the street with cashless bail, pre-trial release, right? That's him bringing that to North Carolina. That he signed a court settlement in a lawsuit filed by the ACLU and NAACP, where he let 3,500 hardened criminals out of North Carolina prisons because he didn't want them to get COVID. You know,
I remember that.
And you look at what has happened with that group. You mentioned Irena Zarotska on a light rail car. DeCarlos Brown Jr. was one of those that was on the list, right? Been arrested 14 different times, released 14 different times. That monster should have never been on the light rail car. Should have never, ever, Irena Zarotska should be alive today. And her blood, frankly, is on Roy Cooper's hands. But he also is the same guy who vetoed legislation to tell sheriffs they have to honor ICE detainers, get violent criminal illegal aliens out of North Carolina. And then you can talk about what he did in terms of vetoing legislation to help protect our kids as they go through school. So there's just a very long litany when we talk about Roy Cooper and what that guy, we do not need to promote that type of activity. You think about the elections that we have facing us right now and the issue sets that America is facing right now. Roy Cooper is going to vote every single time against North Carolina's interest. He's going to vote with Chuck Schumer. He's going to vote with Bernie Sanders. He's going to follow, the policy leads of Zoran Mamdani and James Tallarico and, Kamala Harris, his best friend, and Joe Biden. That's where he ideologically is centered.
The thing that I talk to a lot of people, you and I think both travel or have traveled in our careers quite a bit. But the thing that kills me is you'll have people speculating, why are they doing this? How could they do this? The reality is it doesn't matter what we think their intentions are. The point of a system is what it does, is what it produces. Yes. And right now, this system, when it's run by Democrats and when it's not fought back by Republicans effectively, you have criminals being prioritized. You have illegal immigrants, illegal aliens who are breaking into our country being prioritized. We were running through the numbers for homeless people, right? The scams that they have going in California, where they're spending $91,000 annually per homeless person with all the taxpayer funding. And you think none of this makes sense until you realize this is the point. It's to crash the system. It's to break us. It's to break our spirit, to make us think that the system's just so far gone. And it's never going to change until we throw these guys out on the streets.
Yeah, look, the fact is we need, a solid government that is going to do better, right? We need a government that is going to enable families to get married, to have kids, to buy a home, to be able to raise their kids just like I did, and we're not seeing that right now out of the left. The Democrats ran last cycle on open borders, inflationary spending, and a woke, weak America. And they lost. They lost at every level. They lost in the House. They lost in the Senate. They lost, obviously, the White House. What are they running on right now? They're doubling down on that exact same failed agenda. What is Roy Cooper running on in North Carolina? That exact same agenda. He's made it very clear. He's going to fight President Trump at every turn. He's going to vote against his nominees. He's going to vote against his legislation. He's going to vote for impeachments. He is going to do everything he can to take the Senate back to where we were with Democratic control and Joe Biden in the office. And you think about what that means. Well, that clearly means 9% inflation annually, 40% inflation over 4 years. Housing prices doubled, grocery prices through the roof, gasoline prices up 50, 60%. The American family is going to be hard pressed to succeed with Roy Cooper in the Senate and the Democrats in control.
What's so crazy is like you see Democrats on TV attacking Trump and Republicans for the gas prices. Obviously, it's because of this controversy in Iran. This is not the policy goals or the policy outcomes of our energy policies here. But this is the goal of the Democratic Party. Like, regardless of whether or not there's a conflict in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz being shut down, their climate agenda means $7, $8, $9 per gallon of gas to fight the climate change stuff that they're pushing for. They want this. And so it's hilarious to me to see Democrats talking about, we need lower energy prices. This has been a disaster. The whole point of your existence right now is to jack up our energy prices and our local taxes, period.
Yeah. And look, gasoline prices are high, right? And think about two things. First off, they're still lower than they were under Joe Biden's regime, right? When we had a national, average of $5 a gallon. And we see today that they're high, but they're not that high. And then secondly, because President Trump unleashed American energy and he put American production into overdrive, that shock is not nearly as bad as it would have been had this happened with Joe Biden,
Mm-hmm.
right? And where we were to start with. But you're absolutely right that climate agenda is all about control. And it's all about saying you're not going to be able to drive. You're not going to be able to fly. You're going to have to reduce that carbon footprint. You're going to have to buy electric cars, which are going to cost exponentially more. You can go down any one of these, trails in these conversations, and it gets you, like you said, back to the same place.
There was an interesting chart the other day I saw. It was just a map of border town in Arizona. The gas prices were like $4.05 a gallon, and then the border town right across in California, it was over $7.
Yeah.
Right. But I want to tie this or go back to crime. What would you want to do from a national level? Like, what haven't we been able to get done because of the filibuster or whatever on crime that you think could help out North Carolina?
Sure. I think honestly, of all of the issue sets that we have in North Carolina, crime is the one that is speaking to the people the most loudly right now. Because Roy Cooper, did march with BLM and Antifa, because Roy Cooper did set up that revolving door to put criminals back on the streets again 20, 30, 40, 50 times. We just had a murder in Wilmington on Easter, right? A 21-year-old Marine was stabbed and killed. And it turns out the guy who did it had been arrested and released 60 different times.
My goodness.
Under Roy Cooper's policies. And we talk a lot about Irena Zarotska and her killer, DeCarlos Brown Jr., but he's far from the only one. Mm-hmm. That catch and release system is just, it puts additional hardship on the community. It puts additional hardship on the law enforcement officers who have to put themselves at risk to go back and rearrest, these violent criminals again and again and again, and see them back out on the street, first thing the next morning,
Mm-hmm.
and so we made a pledge on day one, we're going to do everything we can to back the blue. We're going to make sure that we have more officers on the street and
Mm-hmm.
more criminals behind bars where they belong.
That's the thing is you look in cities like Chicago. I'm from Illinois, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
most familiar with Chicago. But the neighborhoods that are the most violent are the ones where they don't send the cops. And there's this thing with the BLM when they're calling to defund the police. That if we don't send police there, that means we hate you. We've given up on your community. We actually look at you as like animals who are unsavable, and we're not going to risk the lives of our men in blue. And it's just so we obviously need more cops. I think the second violent offense probably should be pretty heavy. Like, if I've gotten speeding tickets and then I cut back on my speeding, right? Like I get a seatbelt ticket. I wear a seatbelt every time now. Some people don't care. And those are the people that are really, it's like, I think Matt Walsh might have even come out with this just recently. It's like 5% of Americans are the ones committing like 95% of all the crimes. Let's cut back on those people.
Well, and you look at what happened in D.C. when President Trump brought in the National Guard and said we are going to keep D.C. safe. Crime is absolutely down. Murders are absolutely down. Violent crimes are down, on every single category. That is exactly what we need right now. Do we need federal, resources in every city? No, right? But we do need to back local law enforcement. We do need to make sure that they have resources so that they can go out. And we cannot have these catch and release systems like Roy Cooper set up, where you're just putting the perpetrators back out on the streets immediately. We should have a conversation about the judges and the magistrates and the prosecutors to make sure that they're actually going to prosecute these guys and keep them off the streets.
Yeah, at a certain point, you have to question these people's ability to serve on the bench if they're letting these criminals out 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 more times. 60 times is criminal. I want to kind of change topics a little bit because you were one of the first signers. I think you might have been the first signer of APP's Big Family Pledge, which is such a no-brainer. It's no men and women's sports, no sex change procedures for kids, protect kids' innocence online, strengthen parental rights. It's NDEI. It's so easy, but we knew you would be the first to sign it or one of the first to sign it because you spearheaded the entire effort at the RNC to update the party platform so that included those everything we included in this Big Family Pledge was stuff you already got into the whole RNC platform, which I was very proud to be the first public policy leader to sign on to. This was 2 years ago it was obviously popular with the people, but what was behind that effort? I mean, you're from North Carolina. I imagine Roy Cooper had to have something to do with that.
He did, and it was very interesting. We were in Charlotte back in 2020 at a rally. Was the first time that I heard President Trump say we're not going to let men in women's sports. And I thought, why in the world do we have to have this conversation? Why does this have to be part of a campaign?
Yes.
We should not have boys and girls sports.
Yes.
We should not have men in women's locker rooms.
Yes.
And we need to protect our kids. Our campaign, the central focus of it is keeping our kids and our community safe. It's a talking point, but it's so much more than that. And you think about what does it mean, for me, right, to have grown up, gone to public schools, gone to a public university, raised my kids, that I've been able to get married and have 3, fantastic kids. That really, truly matters. And I want that for everybody, but I don't just want it as a political talking point.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make sure, right, that the Parents' Bill of Rights,
yes,
goes forward. And Chuck, Roy Cooper vetoed the Parents' Bill of Rights. He vetoed legislation that would, prevent doctors from performing gender mutilation surgeries on kids, and puberty blockers, things along those lines. And just, you look at his record and what it means. It means that he is beholden to the farthest left of the farthest left, whether that's from California or New York or somewhere else. But that is not North Carolina values, and President Trump, to his credit, he signaled this very early was going to be an issue set that we want to focus on. And getting boys out of girls sports is not just, a good talking point. It is really a fundamental issue.
Well, and the moment you start to not just adopt lies, but to enshrine lies into your legal system, the bottom falls out. I mean, it's no wonder we're letting criminals off the hook after their 60th offense when we're passing laws that say men can compete in women's sports as long as they claim to be women. I mean, they're 2 different degrees of fraud and lying, but they're there.
When you look at Riley Gaines, right?
Yes.
Who has just been an absolute champion on these types of issues, and being beaten by a male swimmer.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got a young lady in North Carolina who was hit in the face by a volleyball that was hit by a guy, in a game, and long-term implications, concussions and vision issues and things along those lines, that Peyton has had to deal with. These things are wrong, and you look at the woke that we have in the schools, you look at the issues that are being taught, you look at the books that are in the libraries. I always joke that, when my mom ran the library, she didn't have those kind of books in it, right?
And she would have been on the front lines of keeping those books out, saying, what the hell are you trying to give to these children?
Right. So this is an issue set, and it's a very strong issue set that when we talk about what kind of a country are we going to have, you need to start with these types of issues and have that conversation.
Well, I look at the trans issue as like a gateway issue. And we've seen this in the focus groups we've done in the polls, where once people realize that this actually is something that Democrats are pushing for and want to legislate, then they start asking other questions. Wait, if they think that men can become women, or that men can have babies, and that men can play in girls' sports and go in their private spaces, are they really going to get tax policy right? Are they really going to get crime policy right? These things are... Your worldview is how you interpret things, and it informs the actions you're going to take. And I don't think it's like, I will tell you, we just got focus group results back from Iowa. Just this Monday, we did a focus group, sat down with a group of men, and then we sat down with a group of women. And it was very interesting because we were asking them about family formation, if it's a problem, and what the causes of the lack of marriages and births in this country. Both groups agreed that family formation was a crisis in America. But the men said it was more cultural and spiritual. The women said it was more economic. They said it was housing affordability, childcare, education costs, healthcare costs. What's your take on it? My position is I think it's everything. I don't think you can separate the culture and the economy are married to each other, and how one behaves is going to inform the other.
Well, you're absolutely right on every front. And if you think about all of those different issue sets that you just talked about, that you listed off from housing prices and, what is somebody going to be able to earn and what are they going to be able to keep with lower taxes, right? How much are grocery costs? How much are housing costs? How much, are we going to have to pay for fuel? Those financial issues, the Democrats are wrong on every one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Roy Cooper's wrong on every single one of them. You talk about the spiritual issues; those really truly matter.
Yes.
And I think that's a conversation that we've got to have. It is an assault on the family that we are seeing right now from the left at every single level. And I think Roy Cooper did a big veto celebration back in 2023 where he vetoed 3 different bills. He vetoed the Parents' Bill of Rights. He vetoed legislation that would block transgender mutilation among kids. And he vetoed the legislation that would block boys and girls sports. And he hailed himself as a hero on this. That's atrocious.
Especially going after parental rights, right?
Right.
The idea that the state can come in and tell parents how to raise. I get coming in cases of abuse, like if you're beating your kid mercilessly and they're having real signs of abuse, yeah, the state should step in and protect those kids. But they're taking parents and they're separating parents from their children over transgender issues, over issues that parents are compelled probably to protect their kids from. But it's weird to me because obviously the family existed before the state. There was a mom and a dad, and they were married, and they had kids, and then they kept having kids, and it grew, and then you have communities, then you have towns, then you have cities. The family precedes the state, so the state has no business actually interfering in the families.
Yeah, look, what we need right now is a state that's going to empower people.
Yes.
We need a state that's going to get out of the way and let people move forward. You talk about, home ownership, the state right now, we've got local zoning ordinances that are making it harder and more expensive to be able to build homes. We've got, government caused inflation that Joe Biden unleashed, where now interest rates are ridiculously high. You think about all of these different factors that go into people's ability to buy homes. Let's set up a government plan to help.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get more homes built, right? Let's make sure that we bring down interest rates. Why don't we give people a tax credit if they're buying first-time home, for a first home as a family? These are some of the steps that we should be thinking about, right? How are we going to help families do better?
So housing prices, I mean, you just said it, they're out of control across the country. The interest rates are high. I think we can get back to normalcy. My colleague, John Schweppe, and I, we wrote an op-ed proposing home savings accounts where you can get $10,000 deducted for putting money into these home savings accounts. It can be used for a down payment. It can be used to pay the principal off quicker. The Washington Post ran that, which is weird. I'm starting to wonder, I'm like, is this a terrible plan? But right. It's gotten pretty good reception. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on introducing like a HSA or a 529 that are typically used for education, but one for home savings accounts.
Yeah, those are the exact kind of conversations that we should be having. How do you change the tax code to actually be helpful? I know Rick Scott is taking a really hard look at this and introduced some legislation that I think we need to have a conversation on. I'd love to support that.
What am I missing? What did I leave out that you think is important for voters to know?
Well, look, I think the biggest thing is, I'm very lucky. I'm blessed, right? I've got a fantastic family. I've had great opportunities to work with President Trump and work with other officials, over the years, coming out of a middle-class background, right? And it's because North Carolina gave me a shot, because America gave me a shot. And when we talk about, why in terms of having a government, it has to be to protect our citizens, to protect our families, to protect our kids. And if the government's not doing that, we have a real problem. We have a real disconnect. And, I'm going to be a champion for families in this race. That's what ultimately we're fighting for.
My dad would always quip. He was a one-term member of Congress from Western Illinois in 2010. And he'd always quip, we got a government right now that's doing almost none of what it should be doing and everything it shouldn't be doing. We got to start flipping this stuff right. It was part of his campaign speech. Right? I think that's more true than ever before.
I completely agree with you. And if you think about my race in North Carolina, you can look at the macro sense and say, okay, we have a 3-seat Republican majority, and North Carolina is the most critical Senate seat in the entire country. And if we lose this seat, chances are we can lose the Senate. And so we need to hold this seat to make sure that President Trump's agenda is going to continue to move forward. And you look at what the Democrats want to do. You look at the ruthlessness with which they're moving. I mean, just last night, Abigail Spanberger, who said, I'm not going to redistrict. And then we just jammed through a redistricting package that's going to completely, rewrite the maps in Virginia. And you think about all of the other, things that have happened since she won that election. In terms of the tax policies.
Oh, they're grabbing guns, raising taxes. We had a $3 or $4 billion budget surplus, and they're still raising our taxes. I think that tells you everything you need to know about Democrats.
And Roy Cooper is telegraphing right now. He's not even hiding it like Abigail Spanberger did. He's going to vote to raise taxes because that's what he's always done. He's going to vote for impeachment. He's going to vote against the nominees that President Trump would move forward with it. He is going to be very radical. The leadership in the Democratic Party has already said, we're going to impeach. We're going to impeach not just Trump. We're going to go after cabinet secretaries. We're going to go after other officials all across the government. We're going to shut it down. You think about what is the Democratic Party's platform right now? They don't have a platform.
They don't.
It is just hate Trump.
And I remember, I have to remind my Democrat, I have a handful of Democrat friends that that number's been shrinking every year. Not my fault, but I have to remind them. You guys think Trump's unpopular? Have you looked at the Democratic Party's unpopularity? Because they're not. People aren't really loving them either, and actually, their approval rating in many cases is lower than Trump's. They don't have an agenda. They don't have a plan, and what they do have is actually a plan to favor our enemies, favor our invaders, favor the people that aren't actually contributing to this country at the cost of those that are working hard and living honest lives. It's atrocious, and it'll never be popular.
It really is, and Roy Cooper is going to fight harder for men who want to play in girls' sports and go into women's locker rooms. He's going to fight harder for criminals. He's going to fight harder for illegal aliens than he is the people of North Carolina. I'm going to fight for families. I'm going to fight to support law enforcement, and I'm going to fight for every family and community in North Carolina.
Well, I'm very proud that APP and our big family has endorsed you. I'm proud to be associated with you. It was, again, like I said, a no-brainer. But we're going to raise as much money as we can to get involved and help your race. But we need to get the money to you first. So where can people find you and support your campaign?
MichaelWhatley.com, or they can follow me on X at WhatleyNC.
Very good, Michael. I can just tell you and tell the audience that you are a man of God. You're unique in that you understand the importance of these policy battles, but you also understand the politics of them and how to win on them. And that is something you really don't find very much with other politicians. And so we're very lucky, very, very blessed to have you, especially have you running in such a tough year. I think you're going to pull it out, and we're going to be there with you every step of the way that we can. So God bless you, brother.
Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.